we're gonna get familiar with some of the terminology. So first, let's look at inelastic demand. Loosely speaking, when we don't have numbers, when we don't have calculations, when we say a demand is price inelastic, what that means is quantity demanded does not respond strongly to price changes. Technically speaking, so strictly speaking, if we have numbers and if we have the calculation, when we say a demand is inelastic, what that means is the absolute value of the price elasticity of demand is less than 1. So 1% change in the price leads to less than 1% change in the quantity demanded. Okay, so that's an inelastic demand. The opposite is elastic demand. So loosely speaking, when we don't have numbers or calculation, what that means is quantity demanded responds strongly to changes in price. Okay? So a certain change in price leads to a large change in the quantity demanded. But technically speaking, if we have numbers or a calculation, so an elastic demand means the absolute value of the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1. So 1% change in the price leads to more than 1% change in the quantity demanded. That's what it means by elastic demand. So let's look at an example. I don't want you to pay too much attention to the calculation at this point. Okay? So the calculation is done for you. Okay? So initially, the price is at $5 and the quantity demanded is 50. So we are here. So for some reason the price drops to $4, okay? And accordingly the quantity demanded increases to 100 units. So we're here. So when you calculate the price elasticity of demand, in this case that's a midpoint method, the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price using the midpoint method, you get -3. So -3, the absolute value of -3 is greater than 1. So that means the demand is price elastic. Okay. So 1% decrease in the price leads to 3% increase in the quantity demanded in this case. Okay? So let's look at others. Let's get familiar with other terminology. Perfectly inelastic. Quantity demanded does not respond to price changes at all. This is an extreme case, of course. The price elasticity of demand is equal to 0. What that means is regardless of the change in the price, there will be no change in the quantity demanded. As you can see, this is a very extreme case, which means it is hard to find examples in real life. Okay? But we can find examples that are close to perfectly inelastic. Can you think of some examples? Can you think of some examples where no matter how the price changes, consumers or buyers do not have much choices? So some of you may start to think about drugs, right? Whether it's illegal drugs or legal drugs, medication, okay? Medication. Okay? Some of you may even think about smoking, okay? Maybe the addictions to tobacco product is not as extreme as to drugs, but still it is pretty inelastic. Okay? Close to, okay? Water. and other utilities, electricity, for example. So that's why in many countries, the price of water, the price of electricity is highly regulated because there is not much room that buyers can bargain. So another terminology is perfectly elastic. This is another extreme case. As you can see, the price elasticity of demand is negative infinity. What that means is quantity demanded changes infinitely with any change in price. Once again, it is an extreme case, so that means it is very difficult in real life to find an example that is perfectly elastic, but we can find examples that are close to perfectly elastic. So a tiny, teeny change in the price will lead to a very, very large change in the quantity demanded. Okay. Unit elastic, that's when the quantity demanded changes by the same percentage as the price. Okay. So technically speaking, the price elasticity of demand is equal to -1, or the absolute value of the price elasticity of demand is equal to 1. So I keep saying the absolute value of the price elasticity of demand. So that means we drop the negative sign. Okay. So we have done quite a few examples. So you probably notice that the price elasticity of demand is always a negative number because of the law of demand. So the price of a good and the quantity demanded of that good, holding everything else constant, they move in opposite direction. So it is always going to be negative. So if you do your calculation and you find a price elasticity of demand that is not a negative number, something is wrong there. So because it's always negative, it is common to see the negative sign being dropped for a price elasticity of demand, as it is understood that it is always negative. So in your textbook, sometimes you see price elasticity of demand without a negative sign. And that is probably not an error. Well, your textbook do have some errors sometimes, but probably not this one. This one is probably done deliberately. The negative sign is dropped deliberately for convenience. Because when you look at two numbers here, -3, -1, and -3. So mathematically, which one is a larger number? So when you think about math, mathematically, -1 is a larger number, right? Okay. However, when you think about elasticity in our jargon, in our terms, which one is larger? Which one has larger price elasticity of demand? Which one is more elastic? This one. -3 is more elastic, has larger price elasticity of demand. So in order to avoid confusion, and we all know that, price elasticity have to be negative sign anyway, so it is common, then we drop the negative sign just to avoid confusion. Okay. So let's look at some graphs. Okay. So at this point, let's not pay too much attention to the calculation. Okay. Let's just get familiar with the shape of the graph. Okay. So this is a perfectly inelastic demand. So this is when the price elasticity of demand is equal to 0. So as you can see, as the price goes up, the quantity is fixed. The quantity demanded stays the same at 100. So when we have a vertical demand curve, that means we have a perfectly inelastic demand. The quantity demanded simply doesn't change at all. And we have now a normal looking demand curve, downward sloping demand curve. Okay? So as the price increases from $4 to $5, okay? So here's a 22% increase in price, and the quantity demanded drops. You can see it is an 11% decrease in quantity demanded. Okay, so the price elasticity of demand is less than 1. The absolute value of the price elasticity of demand is less than 1, and by definition, that's an inelastic demand. And then we have a flatter demand curve. Okay, a flatter demand curve. Okay, so a 22% increase in price leads to a 22% increase in quantity demanded. So one-to-one relationship, that's a unit elastic demand by definition. So the price elasticity of demand is equal to 1. Okay? And then we have an even flatter demand curve. Okay? So this is when a 22% increase in price leads to 67% decrease in quantity demanded. So that's what we mean by elastic demand by definition. So the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1 in its absolute value. And then we have the last case, perfectly elastic demand. So you can see that at the price at this $4, the buyers can buy any quantity. Okay. However, when the price goes tiny little bit above $4, the quantity demanded become 0. Nobody's gonna buy it from this seller. Okay. Okay. And then if the price is below $4, the quantity demanded is infinite, so it's not defined. Okay. So no sellers will go below $4. Okay, so this is a horizontal line, and this is a perfectly elastic demand. Okay, the price elasticity of demand is equal to infinity. So let's look at the diagram one more time. This time I'm going to go over it very quickly, and I don't want you to pay too much attention to the number, but instead I want you to look at the relationship between the price elasticity of demand and the shape of the demand curve. So this is the perfectly inelastic demand. So this is when the price elasticity of demand is equal to 0. And this is an inelastic demand. This is when the price elasticity of demand is greater than 0, but is less than 1. And then the price elasticity of demand increases to 1. So unit elastic demand. And then we have this. So this is when the price elasticity of demand increases even further. It's greater than 1 in this case. So this is an elastic demand. And then the last one, horizontal demand curve. Okay, so perfectly elastic demand when the price elasticity is equal to infinity. Okay, so if you want to, you can go over this slide one more time. Okay? But many of you probably have observed that, the smaller the price elasticity of demand, the steeper the demand curve. Okay, so the more inelastic the demand curve, the demand is, and the more vertical or the steeper the demand curve. Okay, in other words, the more elastic the demand curve, the demand is, the flatter the demand curve. Okay, so the larger the price elasticity of demand in its absolute value, the flatter the demand curve. So many of you may find there is a relationship between the slope of the demand curve, okay, so flat, steep, okay, and the price elasticity of demand, which is true. Okay, so the price elasticity of demand, if you look at the formula closely, is closely related to the slope of the demand curve, but they are not exactly the same thing. Okay? So when you look at both the formula of the slope of the demand curve and a price elasticity of demand, they are not exactly the same. Just to show you an example. Okay? So once again, I don't want you to put too much attention to the calculation at this point. Okay? So in this case, we are given the demand curve, so the price and the corresponding quantity demanded. So you can find the percentage change in price and the percentage change in quantity demanded. So as a result, you can calculate the price elasticity of demand. Okay. So what you can see here is as the price comes down, as the quantity demanded goes up, the price elasticity of demand decreases. So we go from elastic to inelastic. Okay. So this is the demand curve using, we plot the demand curve, okay, using the information. Okay. You can see that according to our calculation, this part here, the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1. This is when the quantity demanded is small enough and the price is high enough. Okay, and then at some point here, we have a unit elastic demand, and then afterwards, when the quantity demanded keeps increasing, it's large enough when the price keeps coming down. This part here is elastic. Is inelastic. Okay, inelastic. So we go from elastic to inelastic. Okay. So this is just to show you that price elasticity of demand is not necessarily equal to the slope. So this is a linear demand curve. The slope is obviously not the same as the price elasticity of demand. So much for the definition. So now let's look at some of the rules of thumbs. Okay? So when we are given numbers, we can calculate the price elasticity of demand. But sometimes we're not given any details, numbers. Sometimes we simply don't need to know the numbers. We just want to have an idea of how elastic a product is. So this is when we can rely on some rules of thumb or some determinants of the price elasticity of demand. So the first factor that can affect the price elasticity of demand is the availability of close substitutes. Okay? So think of an example, okay? A pair of examples. Big pens. I'm sure many of you do not pay attention to the brand of the pens that you use. So now is probably a good opportunity. So let's look at the pens that you are using. What brand is it? BIC, Big Pens. Big is one of the brands of pens. So some of you use what? Pilot, right? Some of you use the, what else? Okay. Stedler or the Staples plan, the Staples brand, okay? But either way, not many of us pay attention to the brand of the pens that we are using. So let's say if the price of a big pens, okay, the price of big pens rises by 50%. The prices of big pens rises by 10%. 10%. Okay. Will you stick to big pens, or will you just very quickly switch to other brands of pens? Many of you really don't care which brands of pens that you are using, right? Okay. So with the 10% increase in big pens, many of you will not hesitate to switch to other brands of pens. So that means the demand for big pens is elastic, is pretty elastic compared to Windows operating system. So let's say the price of Windows operating system goes up by 10%. We don't like it, but how many of us are going to switch to other operating system? So what are some of the viable competing operating system out there? Some of you may think of, iOS, right? Apple, by Apple. Some of you think of some open system like Linux, okay? So not a lot of them out there, okay? And even with iOS, many of us are reluctant to switch from one operating system to another because the learning curve is pretty long. So when the price of Windows operating system goes up, even though we don't like it, buyers usually are stuck. So that means the demand for Windows operating system is fairly inelastic compared to big pens. Okay, so that's because Windows operating system doesn't have many close substitutes. So now let's look at other determinants of the price elasticity of demand. The nature of the product. Essentially, whether it is a necessity or a luxury. So let's compare medicine versus handbags. So if the price of medicine goes up by, 50%, for example, you are outraged, you do not like it. But how many patients would just turn away from the medication? Probably not a lot, right? Okay, because medicine is a necessity. The demand is fairly inelastic versus handbags. So if the price of handbags goes up by 50%, many of us would just say, well, we can wait. I can live with one fewer handbags. How many handbags do you need, right? Yeah. Although some of us would argue that handbags are also a necessity, but when it comes to that time, we know that we can live with one fewer handbags. We can buy handbags next year. Okay? So handbags in this case is a luxury. Okay? So the demand is pretty price elastic. The next determinant of the price elasticity of demand is the definition of the market. It depends on how broadly or how narrowly the market is defined. For example, cell phones versus iPhone. Okay? So cell phone is defined very, very broadly. Okay? So it includes many types of cell phones, smartphones or the basic cell phones, and also many brands of smartphones and basic cell phones. So it's very broad definition. So how many of us, if the price of cell phones in general goes up, how many of us can live without cell phones? I don't know about you. I mean, I will have anxiety attack if I leave home without a cell phone. Right? My whole life is on there, right? Okay? So the demand for a cell phone is pretty inelastic because it is defined very broadly, and because it's defined very broadly, it's a broad category, it's difficult to find substitutes for it. Versus iPhone. iPhone is defined very narrowly. It is just one type of smartphone. Okay? No matter how many Apple fans out there, okay, when the price of iPhone goes up, we have choice. We can quite easily switch to other brands of smartphones. Okay? So the demand for iPhone is relatively elastic compared to cell phones. The next one is the weight of the product in the total consumption budget. For example, toothpaste versus a car. So if the price of toothpaste goes up by, 50%. It's outrageous. How much does a toothpaste go for these days? Obviously, it depends on the brand, right? But on average, $3 or $4, $4, for example. So if the price of toothpaste goes up by 50%, we are not happy. So we will stand in the aisle of the supermarkets and curse and stuff like that, right? Okay. But how many of us will go home without a toothpaste? How many of us would say, well, I would just not brush my teeth tonight. I don't like the price. Very few of us, right? Of course, if you are one of them, you don't want to tell me, right? Okay. But very few of us. Okay. So we don't like it, but we still grab a toothpaste and then we go home. So how about a car? When the price of a car goes up by 10%, not even close to 50%, just 10%, okay? So how much does a car go for? Once again, it depends on the brand, the model, right? Okay. Let's say, on average $30,000. So if it goes up by 10%, so that's $3,000 more. So you're shopping for a car and you find out the price of a car goes up by 10%. How many of us would just say, I don't care, I'm going to have to get a car today? Or how many of us will give it a second thought? How many of us would say, well, maybe I can still drive my old car. It can still work for a little while, right? So let's sleep on it. Okay? So many of us will probably hesitate a little bit. Okay? That's because the price of car carries a very large percentage in our total income budget, in our total consumption budget. So that means we respond a lot to that change in the price. So the demand for car is more elastic in this case than toothpaste, simply because, it does affect our welfare because it carries a large percentage in the income. So, and then the last one, time horizon. Natural gas consumption this winter versus natural gas consumption in the long run. So if the price of natural gas spike this winter, we don't like it, but many of us will probably still go about business as usual. We'll still turn on the heater. We don't like it, but we'll probably wear a little bit more clothes. That's about it. Okay, so it's fairly inelastic. But when the price of the natural gas spiked, and everyone knows that it's going to last for a long, long time, it's going to be like that. It's going to stay high for many, many years to come. And that's a different story. So over time, people will start to make adjustment to do without natural gas. So for example, we will spend some money to insulate our house better so that we don't have to use so much heat, right? And we will move to smaller house so that we don't have to use so much heat. Okay? Or, and we will turn to alternative energy source. Okay? So companies will have incentive to make to invent or to put in more investment in new technology or new energy source. Okay? We can turn to coal, for example, although it's not polluting. It is quite polluting. We can turn to solar energy, okay, and so on and so forth. We can even move to warmer places. So these can all take place only in the long run. So the longer time we have to adjust to the change in the price, the more elastic the demand becomes. Okay. So here, let's summarize a little bit what we have just seen. Demand tends to be more elastic the larger the number of close substitutes. Demand tends to be more elastic if the good is a luxury. Demand tends to be more elastic the more narrowly defined the market, iPhone versus cell phone. Demand tends to be more elastic the greater the weight a good constitutes in the total budget. Demand tends to be more elastic the longer the time period. Okay? So I'm going to have you pause the video for a while so that you can work on these examples. Okay? So which one has more elastic demand? Okay? So for each pair of these products, you want to decide which one has more elastic demand. But the most important thing is to explain why. So try to relate each pair of these products, try to relate your answers to the determinants of the price elasticity of demand. So I'm going to have you pause and work on them. Okay, so we'll look at that. So the first one, so many of you probably, so jewelry versus gasoline, right? Which one has more elastic demand? Many of you probably will pick jewelry, okay? Because it is luxury, right? So if you don't like the price, you don't have to have jewelry. But it's a different story for gasoline. Many of us still, have to drive. So cars run on gasoline. So so even though the price of gasoline is not favorable, we may be stuck. We don't have a lot of choices. And then food versus beef, okay? Which one has more elastic demand? Okay, beef, okay? Because it is narrowly defined, it is more narrowly defined, and therefore you can find more substitutes for it. For example, if the price of beef goes up, you don't like it, you can turn to other type of poultry. You can have pork, or you can have chicken. You can also go vegetarian too, right? Okay. And then business travel versus leisure travel. The next one, many of you will probably pick which one? Leisure travel, right? Because when you travel for leisure, it is a luxury. If you don't like the price, you don't have to travel. But if it's a business travel, it is a necessity, right? You have to be there at a certain time on a certain date, or else the business is not there. The deal is over, right? Okay. So and then the last one, cigarettes versus fast food. This one is a slightly tricky one, okay? But when you think about it clearly, okay, which one is more addictive? So when the price of cigarettes goes up, smokers will find it very, very hard to quit. I'm not a smoker, but I guess many of us can understand it's very difficult to quit smoking. It's an addiction. Okay, so fast food. Some of us will argue that fast food is an addiction too, right? Okay, there was a time when I had to drive out, in the middle of the night, just to get a Big Mac. I was so addicted to McDonald's, but I'm sure it's nothing compared to the extent of addiction to tobacco products. Okay, so which one has more elastic demand? Fast food. Easier to find substitute, right?